Period 6 of the APUSH curriculum, starting with 6.1.1, Industrialization and the Growth of Capitalism. So, we're going to be looking at mostly things that are happening after the Civil War now, though this historical period begins in 1865, so we will talk occasionally about things that were happening during it as well, because it has to set up what's going to happen after the war is over, the nation is back together, and it is entering an era of a lot of change. Change in race relations, change in the economy, change in use of the land. Many things are going to be changing in this era, so let's get going. Okay, the first thing we need to talk about is a little bit about what was going on during the Civil War and immediately after, with how the government approached, how it was spending its money on infrastructure. So I've said this before, during the Civil War, Congress was under Republican control. And what that means is that the South wasn't there to be voting on stuff. So what they did is they voted into law, many things that the Southern Democrats didn't want before and had been blocking and obstructing for decades before the Civil War. Okay, so things that are included there: increasing tariffs. So this was during the time mostly how the federal government raised money, and it was typically a Republican policy that they pursued. Also, during the Civil War, we create another centralized banking system. So ever since Andrew Jackson essentially, demolished the Bank of the United States back in the 1830s, we had a decentralized system where it was up to the states. Because there was a Republican policy to want tariffs, to want more centralization of the government, they put this into place when the Democrats are not there to vote on it. Now, some things that are happening amidst all of that is a lot of subsidies. So kind of the opposite of taxes. Instead of the government taking money, the government is giving out money for things that they want to contribute to the nation. One of these were railroads from the 1830s to the 1860s and beyond. 1869 is the year the Transcontinental Railroad is finished. What was needed to create this was a labor force, and this was mostly done by immigrants. So Chinese immigrants in the West, Irish immigrants in the East. And something you need to understand about the Transcontinental Railroad is it wasn't like they were just building one railroad and it was called the Transcontinental Railroad. It was more a series of interconnected railroads that would connect one end of the country to the other end. So that's why they were kind of starting on different ends and meeting up in the middle. Okay, so the government's giving out money and loans for the construction of those. The Pacific Railway Act, notice, passed during the Civil War, helps to get that done on the western side. Before the Civil War, there was the debate as to whether it should take a northern route or a southern route. Well, the South wasn't there to decide on this during the Civil War, so it ended up taking the northern route. The federal government had 175 million acres of land that they let railroad companies use to build on, and they spent $435 million on basically giving out money to the railroad companies to help with the construction of this, because they knew it was going to help the entire nation at the end of the day. Okay, later on, railroads are going to stop going just kind of west to east and start going north to south as well, and that's going to open up Texas and many of the larger states that were previously ignored in the South to develop cities and develop unpopulated areas into what we think of as the Old West. So, these ghost towns, at least what they are today, back then used to be booming when the railroad would come in and provide the ability to transport stuff there. So, along with this new railway system comes the need to decide, well, who's going to be in charge of it? Okay, there were competing views. Should the states be in charge of regulating it? Should private businesses be in charge of it if they were the ones that built it? Should it be the federal government? It wasn't clear. In 1877, the Supreme Court decided in Munn versus Illinois that the states were the ones that got to regulate the railroad businesses, but later this was overturned and private businesses got to control them once again. So the companies that built the railways were the ones that got to control their use. Now, this is going to be later overturned and it's going to be decided to be a federal issue, but that's not for a while, so don't worry about that yet. Now, something to kind of reflect on is the fact that now that there are railways and you want, the trains to show up on time, this created the need for better timekeeping. So before, they just kind of used the sun to decide about what time it is. They'd set their clocks locally, but then you would go one town over and the clocks from your your own watch, maybe a pocket watch, to the watch in the town, or the clock in the town, would be completely different. So time was not synchronized. Now that there was this need about to know when the trains were going to arrive, they start syncing up clocks across towns, across cities, and this creates time zones. So it's saying like, well, if you're in one area, which time zone are you going to be, so you know what time to set your clocks to. Okay, so that's where time zones come from. Something else that the federal government contributed to, but gets developed within the era as well, are communication systems. So the telegraph had existed for some time, but it's in this era where we start having it not just within the United States, but going across the ocean. So from 1858 to 1894, the transatlantic telegraph cable is laid down, basically going through the water from ship to ship to ship, all the way across the Atlantic, so it was now possible to communicate from Europe to North America. Something else that gets developed is the telephone, patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1786. So notice I say the word patented. It's not like he invented it. This idea had been going around for some time, but he was the first to get it registered with the government that it was his invention. By the end of the 1880s, there's 50,000 of them in use, but it's mostly within government and with large businesses. So it's not really until the 1920s or so that we see that individuals have telephones within their houses, and it's easier to communicate with each other. So it starts at kind of an infrastructure level and eventually gets to individuals. All right, so we have all these changes in transportation, communication. What we need to talk about is how this is a new age of industrialization, a new age of capitalism, and one of the major reasons that this era of industrialization is different has to do with the fact that market structures and management programs methods were changing. So we'd had industrialization before. So think like the market revolution, even before in the 1790s with Hamilton encouraging the growth of manufacturing. Now, and there was some industrialization during the Civil War as well, dealing with having to be in total war. But what we get in the late 1800s, so after the Civil War, think 1870s through 1890s, is a new era of industrialization where it's not just creating things through industrial means, but creating things at a large scale using new methods to manage those businesses. Now, one of the things that manages these businesses differently is something called cost accounting. Okay, sounds like a fancy term, but it's really not. It just means that companies are very careful about keeping track and records of how much money they're spending on something, and then using that to figure out their business plan of how much do we have to charge for this product to make sure that we're making a profit and not losing money. So some businesses would use cost accounting to the third decimal place. So we only sell things to the second decimal place, but if they calculate it to the third, to the thousandth place, then that's going to help them better manage how they're using their money. And this helps lead to a management revolution. So what that means is there's a change in corporate structure. So that means that there's kind of the investment level, the business elite at the very top. There's then middle managers. So that means that people who are not involved in the business decisions, but whose job is to run the business and then, yep, teachers do laundry, true, there's my dryer, say hi. Be quiet, there we go. And what this means is that the managers are not involved in the business except for managing the workers, and then there's the majority of the workers doing all the work that are at the very bottom. That is a change in structure. It's much more sort of micromanaged than what we would see with previous industrialization. Okay, there's two major approaches to this management revolution and how to essentially create control of markets. One is vertical integration. So this is when a company controls production from start to end. Now, you've got that picture to the right over there, and here's a way that demonstrates it. The best example is through one of the major industrialists of this time period, Andrew Carnegie, who eventually controlled a large portion of our steel industry, which he did through vertical integration. Now, what this means is that you have a business at each stage of production. So let's look at steel. It says at the very top there, mining, transportation, I think smelting, and then refining, and another word. What this means is these are four of the major steps in the production of steel. So if you just own one stage of production, then you've got to do business with other parts of production, and you're going to help them make a profit. Andrew Carnegie said, well, how about if I own each part of this industry, so I only ever have to do business with myself, which cuts down costs and brings a bigger profit for myself. Now, a mnemonic device that I use to help you remember vertical integration is that steel is a major component in building skyscrapers. What's the shape of skyscrapers? Vertical. Steel and skyscrapers, vertical integration. Now what he did in its essence, like I just said, he created this economic empire where he didn't have to do business with other companies that he didn't own. And that helped him become one of the richest men in America at the time. Now there's another approach to controlling a market, and this is called horizontal integration. Horizontal. And what this means is that the company tries to buy up all their competition at one stage of production. Okay? And usually that means they control the entire industry because every other company has to go through them to do business. This was performed by a major industrialist named John D. Rockefeller. His company was Standard Oil. And if you look at the picture at the bottom right, you can see that the stages in oil production are drilling, transportation, refining, and then sales and sort of distribution of the oil. Well, what John D. Rockefeller did is he started a business with just refining, and then as other businesses did worse than he did, he bought them up and merged them with his own company. And what this eventually leads to is if you were in the oil transportation business or the sales component, you had to do business with John D. Rockefeller in order to get ahead. And what that meant is he could really set any price he wanted to, and you would have to go along with it because he was the only person you could do business with to participate in that market. Another change in these management structures has to do with labor being de-skilled and divided up, and that's the assembly line production. So before, people used to make a product from raw materials to finished product. And of course, it's a long process with many steps that you have to figure out, how do I make this efficient? It was done in things like the putting out or the cottage industry. Now what's happening in factories is the creation of one item is broken up into many steps, and then people are hired to only do one step. That means they only need to know how to do one thing for the entire production, and they do that all day long. Okay, so it increases efficiency, and it also makes your labor source, your workers, expendable. Because it means if someone is trying to make trouble, trying to start a union, or asking for a raise, you can say, you're fired because I can easily replace you with someone who just has to learn one skill. So this was very much in favor of the business elite and those in control of the companies, and really worked against the working class. Now what makes this even stricter is something called Taylorism or scientific management. It was taking cost accounting and applying it to labor. So what they would do is for every single worker, it was a middle manager's job to time how fast they were working. So if anyone knows that clip from that episode of I Love Lucy from, was it the 1950s, where she's working on the assembly line wrapping the chocolate, her one job is to wrap up the chocolate, right? And it's sort of, this humorous piece where it starts to go so quickly that she can't keep up, and she starts eating the chocolate and sticking it down her shirt. It creates sort of this, this humor. But that's actually what happened. They would speed up the time, and if you couldn't keep up, you were gone, you would be replaced. They'd time everyone, find whoever was working the slowest, fire them, and hire new people, and do this regularly to keep the labor systems efficient. So you can see changes in management led to increases in efficiency and increases, therefore, in profit for the business owners. And really, this is one of these components where you could argue that industrialization really occurred in the late 1800s because of this change in the business models and structure, not just change in the products being made. All right, next up, what's happening dealing with the cost of labor and the people working in these jobs, right? So there's two different jobs that exist in this industrial economy. One are white-collar jobs. So those are professional jobs, service-oriented jobs. They're called white-collar jobs because the idea is you could wear a nice, clean, crisp, white-collared shirt, and you'd never get it dirty because you're not actually working with your hands. That's where that term comes from. These would be managers who are overseeing labor and production. They're not, like I said, making business decisions, but they're in a service-oriented job. They're managing people. They're not really doing the manual work themselves. Now, among white-collar jobs also come sales positions. As these new companies are making new products, they need to figure out how to sell those all across the country, especially in a country that's really spreading all across the continent at this point. They're trying to create a consumer culture where Americans are seen as their market for selling their goods, and you want to develop consumerism, the idea that people start to define themselves by their possessions, and also hope to achieve greater wealth and status through what they owned in the future. Ways that these were achieved: department stores. So originally department stores actually had departments. Today we think of department stores as mostly for clothing and shoes and what else is there in there? You know, perfume and makeup. Okay? Department stores back in these days used to be more akin to what like Sears is today, where yes, there's a clothing department, but then there's the outdoor department selling tractors. There's the appliance department selling washers, dryers. Today, TVs, dishwashers, all these different sorts of things. What this meant is people could go to one place to buy all these different things, right? Because these new things are being developed at the same time. Sales positions there were still white-collar jobs. Something else being created are mail-order catalogs, which they would send to you for free, provided you buy something, and it had a list and printed of every single thing that you could buy from their store, even if you couldn't make it to the department store. So that appealed to people that are living out in homesteads, increasingly kind of in the Great Plains area, so they could get it delivered to them through the train. You could even buy an entire house through here, and then you just got all the parts, and then you had to put it together. They sold absolutely everything. I have some scans of one of these that a student showed me last year. Her family had one of these catalogs from the early 1900s. I can show you those to you in class when we do our debrief. Okay, these were manufactured goods they were selling, and of course things are more profitable if you sell them in mass quantities at the mass level of production. Such low wages were being paid to the workers that it was possible, but you had to sell everything to make a profit. Now, the other side of the labor market is blue-collar work. So this is manual, unskilled labor. It's called blue-collar because it's the idea that the workers had to wear something made like of a thick, like denim jean material, or thick material that you might see like mechanics still wear today, because you know your job, it's going to get you dirty and oily and greasy, and you don't want that, you know, if you're a white collar, to get on your, you know, squeaky clean, bright and white shirt. That's where this term blue collar comes from. It's manual labor. What came along with their jobs were health hazards, dangerous conditions. Many of these jobs could be in coal mines or working on railroads, so actually working on the trains and shoveling the coal into the engine to keep it going. These were not safe jobs, and at this time period, there were no safety laws. There was no like workman's comp. There was nothing. So if you died on the job, tough. Your family was on their own. If you got injured on the job, you lost your job with no recourse, and tough. Your family now had a one less source of income. All right? So, not happy times for blue-collar workers, but when is it really? Okay, get some caffeine right now, because we're going to have to talk about economics, and it's kind of boring. Okay, so try your hardest to pay attention to this. I'll try not to fall asleep, too. We need to talk about something called the difference between the real wage and nominal wage. Nominal wage is the dollar amount you get per hour, regardless of when it happens. So the actual money that you look at, what is your wage? So when you think of like minimum wage, some places it's $10, $15, $7.25 I think is the federal minimum wage at the time, right now in 2017. That is the nominal wage, just what it means. Now, that's useful for understanding your own context in your own time, but it's not useful for understanding economic trends. What you have to look at for economic trends is something called real wage. And what you do is you compute this by comparing wages across time compared to economic growth of the country, which shows you how much can $1 really buy you. Now, when you compute this, you can judge economic prosperity and standard of living in any era. You'll see that as if minimum wage never rises, then the real wage actually decreases because prices are always getting higher, but they're still getting paid the same amount. This is another thing I can show you a picture of in class if you're interested. Okay, if you look on the left, it says in this era real wages were increasing, but there was still a large wage gap between the rich and the poor. You can look at this through the example of impoverished conditions in things called tenements, so tenement housing. This is where most of the working class lived. They were these apartment buildings, I think typically 6 stories high, and they usually didn't have like indoor plumbing. They might have 1 bathroom per floor or a courtyard in the middle of the building where everyone kind of dumped their waste, and also where all the bathrooms were located. I always put it in terms of bathrooms because it really gets you grossed out to think that these were really poor living conditions that were unsanitary. And again, there were absolutely 0 regulations to say that things had to be legally safe to live in. That's one reason industrialization could grow so much in this era. There were no governmental limitations on what was allowable. So these businesses and corporations could basically get away with whatever they wanted with no recourse for the effect on their workers and the people living in those conditions. All right, so let's talk about kind of how capitalism is growing, but in some ways capitalism is failing in its ideals as well. And this is shown through the creation of things called trusts. A trust is a small group of people who own majority stock in competing firms in the same industry. So what that means is, let's say we're in the oil industry and there's 5 different companies. Well, what they did is they figure out, hey, let's just have the people who own and control these 5 companies serve on each other's board of directors and own stock in each other's companies. So anytime that one company needs to make a decision, they can just make the decision as a whole industry and set prices in an oligopoly. So a market where it's controlled by a small group of people. And what this essentially does is it prevents competition. And here's the thing about capitalism. Capitalism works when competition is encouraged. It's the idea that anyone can make money if they're willing to take the risks in order to do that. But what happens, and really this is the era where capitalism starts to get questioned on the wide scale. This is when sort of socialism and communism get developed because of things like trust. So what happens when some people use capitalism to get super rich, but then use the lack of regulation within capitalism to then prevent other people from competing with them? In capitalism, the government shouldn't be making any regulations on those people at the top from doing that. So capitalism is an economic ideology that doesn't actually work perfectly, and this is a good example of that. Competition is supposed to drive capitalism, but what happens when capitalism prevents competition? That's when we get to some problems, especially in this era. Okay, major industrialists that we've talked about before were ones that helped to form these trusts. So John D. Rockefeller created the Standard Oil Trust, Andrew Carnegie a steel trust, Cornelius Vanderbilt a railroad trust, J.P. Morgan a banking trust. So essentially what happened is these 4 men controlled most of those whole industries and prevented anyone from competing with them. And if they had rivals within the industry, they could then use their economic power to make those companies fail. So I think there's one example of how Andrew Carnegie, remember, he was vertical integration, so he owned some railroads to transport his steel. But when other companies wanted to use his railroads, he would deny it to some of them, saying, no, you can't use it because I don't want you competing with me. You know, I think there's the story about him owning this one bridge on a railroad that was the one connection, and if you were on his bad side, he wouldn't let your company use his bridge, so you couldn't transport your goods, which then prevents capitalism from working as a system. Okay? Now, these issues with capitalism bring up a major debate: robber barons or captains of industry. It's still a major debate today as to how we should interpret men in those yellow terms right above. There's kind of 2 points of view. Robber barons are the idea that they use their economic power and the lack of regulation in capitalism in order to prevent others from competing with them, which made them kind of robbers, thieves, from other companies, but barons at the same time because they're like these lords at the top of industry. The other point of view is there are these captains of industries that really help build up our nation to the economic powerhouse that it becomes. So You can view their innovations as ways that propelled us onto the world stage to compete with industrialized nations. They created new technological means through entrepreneurship and risk that developed our economy. Again, you can also view them as they manipulated the system. They knew that the lack of regulations could help propel them forward while also preventing others from competing with them, which really contradicts what capitalism is supposed to be about. People would say that they abused their workers and created radical responses. Radical responses are things like communism, socialism, and anarchism, which develop because this huge gap between the rich and the poor during this era of sort of unfettered capitalism. People would say those are responses to the problems developed in this industrial era, and they could also manipulate the government. There's this great cartoon, looks like I didn't put it on here, whatever, of John D. Rockefeller, and he has the White House in his hand, and he has like a jeweler's what are those called? The jeweler's glass or eye that they put in there to look at something closely, and it says, "What a funny little government." It shows how he has the government in the palm of his hand because he controls the oil industry that so much of our industries across the board were dependent upon. All right, so keep this argument in mind. It might be a good topic to write about later on. You never know. All right, so I believe, yep, this is our last slide. What we're dealing with here has to do with we've developed an industrial economy through new management methods, new products being created, steel, oil, railroads, which are promoting an industrial economy, but our markets within the U.S., while large, were not enough to really fill the needs of our very large economy. So what happened is business leaders and our government were looking to open up borders outside of America so that we could sell these new products outside our own lands. One that we've talked about before but is important here too was the Treaty of Kanagawa with Japan. This was a little bit before the Civil War. Remember, Japan used to be an isolationist country. The United States military kind of forces them to open up, but we were focused on trade with them, and we sort of enter in as one of their first trading partners outside of Asia. A new treaty that I don't think I've mentioned before was called the Burlingame Treaty, and this opened up the United States to Chinese immigration. So remember, we wanted a labor force to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, and having the West Coast meant it was easier to get immigrants coming across the ocean from Asia than across the land from Europe and the East Coast. Okay, so this opens up things to us. Eventually, we also lead the crusade to get China as a country open to more foreign powers. So Britain had a bit of a stronghold there because of the Opium Wars, and we can talk about that in class. It's kind of salacious. But eventually, once we're involved, we're like, hey, we're late to the imperialism game. How about we open up China to everyone, including the U.S.? Of course, it was about getting us involved, but we said let's make it open to everyone. But you can see we want it to be open to our trade so we have more markets to sell our goods. Something we do as well was getting Alaska. It was called Seward's Folly at the time. Seward was our Secretary of State that negotiated the treaty to buy this land from Russia. And it was viewed as a big waste of money that we didn't have immediately after the Civil War. Now, one reason we did is just getting Russia out of North America. Later, it proved to be very valuable because there were both oil reserves and gold reserves up there. So a lot of people move up there to participate in the economy going on there. It was viewed as kind of, as you see in the cartoon there at first, buying a big chunk of ice. Little did we know it was going to be very useful for economic resources later on. So that's how we got Alaska. All right, I want to give you a little preview of imperialism that we'll talk about, let's see, I think in historical period number 7, actually. But this is the period where we start looking beyond our borders in order to have new markets to sell our goods. We're looking into Asia, into Latin America, because those are places that are not yet industrialized, so they're looking to buy our new products, but they're also places that have raw materials that if we had economic control, we could extract those resources for our own use. Initially, imperialism had economic goals, not political goals. We will see those political goals when we get to historical period number 7. But imperialism was difficult for the U.S. at first because Britain had already been imperializing the country since God, forever, right? I mean, we used to be part of the British Empire. In the meantime, they controlled a lot of Africa and a lot of Asia as well. France was involved. Other industrialized European nations had been involved in imperial efforts longer than us, which meant when we got there, we had to figure out how can we get involved economically because the political means are not really there at the time. Alright, thank you so much for watching. As always, you've got some note cards to create, red or yellow terms, one per slide. You got a quiz to do by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Get it done. Maybe give me a good point of confusion, not N-A or nah. Okay, maybe a real question. Work on your fun geography assignment, due on the day of the unit test, study your chronology, and the next video is there if you're ready to go there. So, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you for watching as always, and I'll see you in class. Bye.